Tonight, you have exactly 1 day left, and every hour of it is already spoken for. At dawn tomorrow, a bell will ring somewhere near the town square. A crowd will gather whether they want to or not, and you will be the reason they came. That's the arrangement. That's what a death sentence means in this century. Not a private ending, but a public one, announced in advance, attended on schedule. You didn't expect to end up here, though almost nobody in your position ever does. Perhaps it was a debt you couldn't pay, twisted into something worse by a man with more influence than patience. Perhaps it was a word spoken carelessly in the wrong tavern, repeated by the wrong listener to the wrong official. The specifics matter less than you'd think. What matters is simpler and considerably more urgent. You are locked in a stone cell beneath the keep. The door is heavy oak reinforced with iron, and somewhere above you, the sun hasn't fully risen yet on what everyone else assumes is your final day. You don't intend to let it be. There is no guarantee in that decision. People in cells like this one have tried before you, and the town's memory of how those attempts ended isn't the kind of story anyone repeats to encourage the next person to try. A guard's boots pace somewhere beyond the door, unhurried, confident, because why wouldn't he be? Stone doesn't need convincing. Time doesn't need convincing either. And time, tonight, is not on your side. You have roughly 24 hours. You have a cell with one door and no window worth mentioning. You have whatever wits you manage to keep sharp through however many days you've already spent in here, and whatever small details about this place you've noticed without meaning to. A loose stone, a guard's habit, the particular creak that means someone's approaching before you can actually hear their footsteps. None of it guarantees anything. All of it is more than nothing. Somewhere above you, this castle is going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that somewhere in its foundations, a single locked room has quietly become the most important place in it. Guards change shifts on schedule. A cook somewhere is already thinking about tomorrow's crowd and what it will mean for the kitchen. A priest, perhaps, is deciding what he'll say to you before the end, assuming there is one to say it before. You have until dawn. Tonight, you'll find out exactly what 24 hours are worth, when every single one of them might be your last, and why, in a century with no clocks worth trusting and no law inclined to show you mercy, escaping a death sentence was never simply about being brave. It was about being patient enough and awake enough to notice the one mistake your captors don't yet know they've made. You've been in this cell long enough now to know it better than you'd ever wanted to. 6 paces long, 4 wide, give or take, measured out slowly over several days of pacing, when pacing was the only thing available to do. The walls are old stone, damp toward the base where groundwater has spent centuries working its way through mortar, never quite designed to keep it out entirely. Straw covers part of the floor, old and flattened, doing little against the cold rising up from below. There's a single door, oak thick enough that knocking on it produces barely a sound, banded with iron that's rusted at the edges but nowhere near enough to matter. A small barred opening near the top lets in a little light and a little air. And occasionally, when a guard leans close out of boredom, a little conversation you never particularly asked for. You've catalogued every part of this room the way a person does when there's genuinely nothing else to occupy the mind. That crack in the far wall, running roughly waist height, wider at one end than the other. The particular way morning light, on the days you can track it at all, falls through the barred opening and crosses the floor at an angle that shifts with the season. The sound the door makes when it's fully closed versus when it hasn't quite latched, a difference you noticed by accident on your second night here and have paid close attention to ever since. None of this, on its own, is an escape plan. It's simply attention, the only tool a cell like this leaves you with, and you've had rather a lot of time to sharpen it. Somewhere above you, life in the castle continues in the ordinary way it always does, entirely unconcerned with what happens in a room this far beneath it. You can hear footsteps sometimes, muffled through stone and distance, and further off, occasionally, the faint suggestion of a bell or a raised voice, evidence of a whole world still functioning up there while you wait down here. You press a hand briefly against the damp wall, feeling its familiar cold, and think, not for the first time, that a room this thoroughly memorized should by now have given up at least one genuine secret worth using. Tonight, you intend to find out whether it finally has. The man assigned to your corridor today walks with the particular rhythm of someone who's done this exact job for years without much variation, and that rhythm, more than anything else about him, is what interests you. He passes your door roughly every quarter hour, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, though rarely enough to matter. You've learned the sound of his boots, specifically, distinct from the two other guards who occasionally cover this corridor. A particular unevenness in his gait, perhaps an old injury, perhaps simply a habit picked up from years of pacing stone corridors that all look the same after a while. He's not unkind, this one, though he's not especially kind either. He answers a direct question if you ask it plainly, tells you nothing beyond what's already obvious, and seems, if anything, faintly bored by the whole arrangement. A man doing a job, rather than relishing any particular part of it. You've watched him closely enough, over however many days you've had to watch him, to notice small things. He pauses longest near the corridor's far end, where a narrow window lets in actual daylight. Lingering there a few extra seconds each pass, the way anyone might when offered a brief glimpse of something other than stone, he hums sometimes, quietly, a tune you don't recognize, always the same few notes repeated without much attention to where they lead. None of this tells you how to escape, but it tells you something more immediately useful. Exactly how much time passes, reliably, between one appearance of his boots and the next, and exactly how distracted, however briefly, he becomes near that window at the corridor's end. A schedule, once you understand it properly, is simply a gap waiting to be measured. You lean back against the cold wall, listening to his footsteps fade toward the window's end of the corridor, and begin, properly this time, counting. The specifics of how you ended up in this exact cell are less important than the plain fact of it, though your mind keeps returning to them anyway, the way it does with anything left unfinished. Perhaps it was a debt owed to the wrong man, one with enough coin to turn an ordinary dispute into something considerably more serious once he decided you'd insulted him along with failing to pay. Perhaps it was simpler than that, a rumor repeated in the wrong company, twisted somewhere between the tavern where you first said it and the official who eventually heard a version of it worth acting on. Justice in this century rarely concerns itself much with careful proof. A local lord's word carries more weight than a dozen honest witnesses if the witnesses happen to be poorer than he is. A trial, when one happens at all, often takes less time than the walk to the courtroom, decided as much by who you know, or fail to know, as by anything resembling actual evidence. You remember the moment the verdict was read aloud, brief and almost bureaucratic, as though the outcome had been settled well before anyone bothered asking your side of things. You remember the walk down to this cell afterward, guards on either side, neither cruel nor gentle, simply doing a task they'd clearly done many times before, with other men who'd occupied this exact stretch of corridor. None of it felt like it was actually happening to you, not fully, not at first. It still carries a strange unreality some mornings, waking here and needing a moment to remember exactly why. But the reason matters less now than the arithmetic it's left you with. One accusation, one hurried judgment, one sentence carried out at dawn regardless of whether it was ever entirely fair. You've stopped trying to argue the fairness of it somewhere around your third day here. Fairness isn't the thing that's going to get you out of this cell. Attention might. Patience might. You intend to find out which, exactly, before the bell rings tomorrow. Sometime in the mid-morning, a different set of footsteps arrives at your door, unhurried in a way the guard's footsteps never quite manage, and you know before the door opens exactly who it belongs to. The priest is an older man, his robes worn soft at the edges from years of exactly this kind of visit. A task he performs with the particular gentleness of someone who's long since stopped finding it easy. He asks, as he always does, whether you'd like to speak, whether there's anything you'd like recorded. Forgiven, said aloud one final time before it's too late to say it at all. You answer him carefully, the way you've learned to answer everyone since arriving here, offering enough to seem cooperative without offering anything that might matter later. He nods, unsurprised, perhaps expecting exactly this kind of careful reticence from a man in your position. He mentions, almost in passing, details you file away without quite meaning to. The execution's arranged for shortly after dawn, timed to catch the town at its busiest rather than its quietest. A decision made deliberately by whoever's in charge of these arrangements, since a larger audience serves the purpose better than a smaller one. The gallows, he mentions, are being finished today, the sound of construction likely to reach you later if the wind carries it the right way. You listen to all of this with an outward calm you don't entirely feel, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking a question or two that seems reasonable for a condemned man to ask. Before he leaves, he offers a blessing you accept without much conviction either way, and a final piece of information that turns out to matter more than he probably intended. The guard rotation changes fully at nightfall, a larger shift change than the smaller adjustments during the day, briefly reducing the number of men actually watching this corridor, while the new watch settles into position. He leaves without realizing what he's just handed you. You sit with that detail for a long moment after his footsteps fade, turning it over carefully, before allowing yourself, just slightly, something close to hope. There is no clock in this cell, no way to mark time with any real precision, and you've had to learn, out of necessity, to measure hours the way people in this century generally do, by light, by sound, by the accumulated small evidence of a day passing around you, rather than any device built to announce it directly. The angle of light through your small barred window tells you roughly where the sun sits, when there's enough of it to matter. The pattern of bells from the nearby church marks certain hours more reliably, calling the faithful to prayer at intervals that have stayed consistent for as long as you've been here to notice them. The guards' meal breaks offer another rough marker, a shift in corridor traffic that repeats itself daily regardless of which specific guard is on duty. You've built, over your time here, a rough mental map of an ordinary day in this keep, the earliest light and the corridor's morning quiet, the midday bustle when meals are delivered and guards rotate briefly for their own food, the long stretch of afternoon when very little changes, the gradual dimming toward evening, and finally, full dark, when the castle's rhythm shifts entirely into something quieter, more skeletal, fewer people awake to notice anything at all. Today, that rough map matters more than it ever has before. You count backward from dawn, the hour you cannot survive as a prisoner, and forward from now, whatever hour this precisely is, trying to estimate as honestly as you can exactly how much time remains for whatever you're about to attempt. Not much, by any honest estimate. Enough, perhaps, if every remaining hour is used properly, rather than wasted on fear you can't currently afford. You press your back against the cold stone wall, close your eyes briefly, and begin, deliberately, converting whatever fear you're carrying into something closer to focus. The crack running along the far wall has been there since before you arrived, an old fault in stone that's shifted slightly over however many years this keep has stood, widening in one particular spot near waist height, where you've spent considerable quiet time examining it. It isn't large. It wouldn't fool anyone glancing casually into the cell, and it certainly isn't wide enough on its own to offer any real path outward. But it tells you something useful nonetheless. This wall isn't quite as solid as its outward appearance suggests, built well enough to hold for centuries, but not without the ordinary small failures that stone accumulates over that much time. You run a finger along the crack's edge, feeling loose grit crumble slightly beneath the pressure, mortar that's weakened more than whoever built this cell would have wanted. It's the kind of detail nobody bothers repairing in a cell meant to hold prisoners only briefly before their sentence is carried out. Why invest care into a room's long-term integrity when its occupants rarely stay more than a few days at most? You press harder, testing, and a small piece breaks free entirely, falling silently into the straw at your feet. It isn't much. It's also, you allow yourself to consider carefully, not nothing. This particular wall, you already know from the little you've gathered about this keep's layout, backs onto an older section, a partially disused passage that predates the current fortifications, sealed off decades ago, when the castle expanded rather than demolished outright. The way such places often simply get built around rather than properly removed. If that's true, and you have no certain way of confirming it beyond old rumor and half-remembered conversation, then this crumbling section of wall isn't merely a flaw in your cell's construction. It's possibly, just possibly, a door nobody currently remembers exists. You sit back against the opposite wall, considering the crack from a small distance, and begin, quietly, working out exactly how much of today you can afford to spend widening it. Sometime in the mid-morning, as you pause briefly from your careful work at the stone, a voice reaches you through the thick wall, separating your cell from whatever lies beyond it, low and hoarse, clearly addressed to you specifically. You hadn't realized, until this moment, that the cell adjoining yours holds another occupant, someone who's apparently been listening, quietly, to your own restless movements for some while now. The voice belongs to an older man, judging by its rough, weathered quality, and he asks, simply, whether you're the one scheduled alongside him for tomorrow's dawn. You answer carefully, cautiously, uncertain whether this stranger represents genuine company and shared misfortune or some deliberate plant meant to draw out incautious words before your execution. But something in his tired, resigned tone convinces you, gradually, that he's exactly what he claims. Another condemned man, sentenced for reasons he mentions only vaguely, poaching from the Lord's forest to feed a family that had, by his own account, gone hungry one winter too many. He talks for a while, quietly, the particular, rambling honesty of a man who no longer sees much reason for caution. He mentions details about this section of the keep gathered across his own longer imprisonment, confirming, usefully, several things you'd only suspected, that the old passages behind these walls do connect, eventually, toward the working areas of the castle, and that at least one previous prisoner, years ago now, attempted exactly the kind of escape you're currently contemplating. You ask, carefully, what happened to that previous attempt? He answers honestly, caught, eventually, though not before making it further than anyone expected, undone in the end by impatience rather than any fundamental flaw in the plan itself. It's a sobering detail, but a useful one. You thank him quietly for the information, and he responds with something almost like genuine warmth, wishing you better fortune than he expects for himself tomorrow. You return to your work at the wall with renewed, careful determination, the old man's warning about impatience settling firmly alongside everything else you've gathered today. Later in the morning, a different man arrives with your meager ration of food and water, someone you haven't seen quite as often as the pacing guard from earlier, older, heavier, moving with the particular weariness of a man who's held this specific job longer than he'd probably have chosen, given other options. He sets the food down without much ceremony, a hard piece of bread, a cup of water that's more warm than cold, the ordinary, unremarkable provisions given to men in your position. He doesn't meet your eyes especially long, though it isn't unkindness exactly, more the particular discomfort of someone who's grown tired of the part of this job that requires looking directly at men who won't see tomorrow. You've learned a little about him through small fragments gathered over your time here. A wife, mentioned once in passing to another guard within your hearing. A daughter, about to be married. Another detail overheard rather than offered directly. He's not a cruel man, by any measure you've been able to judge. Simply a man doing an unpleasant job in a century that offers few better alternatives to someone without land or title of his own. You consider, carefully, whether there's any use to be made of this small human detail, and decide, just as carefully, that there likely is, though not in any way that requires him to actively help you. Men like this rarely risk their own position for a stranger's sake, however much quiet sympathy they might privately carry. But sympathy, even unacted upon, sometimes shows itself in smaller ways. He lingers, today, slightly longer than strictly necessary, and mentions, seemingly without particular purpose, that the new guard captain arriving with tonight's larger rotation is a stranger to this specific keep, unfamiliar yet with its older passages and half-forgotten corners. He leaves without elaborating further, perhaps not even fully registering the usefulness of what he's just said. You eat the hard bread slowly, turning that detail over in your mind alongside the priest's earlier mention of tonight's rotation, two small overheard facts beginning, cautiously, to form the outline of something resembling an actual plan. Before settling firmly on the wall and the old passage as your primary hope, you spent a good portion of the earlier morning considering, carefully, an entirely different approach, one you eventually set aside, but which still occupies a useful corner of your thinking. The weakened lower hinge on your cell door remained, throughout your planning, a genuine alternative, a more direct route, requiring less reliance on uncertain rumor about old passages and more on simple physical force applied at precisely the right moment. You'd considered, briefly, whether waiting for a single guard to approach closely, perhaps under some pretext, might allow you to overpower him directly, using his own keys rather than relying on any hidden route through stone and forgotten cellar. You'd set this plan aside, eventually, for reasons that still seem sound. A direct physical confrontation carries considerably more immediate risk, both to yourself and to a guard who, whatever his role in your current situation, is likely simply an ordinary man doing an assigned job rather than any particular villain deserving harm. It also offers a far narrower window for error, discovery, or simple bad luck. One dramatic confrontation rather than a series of smaller, quieter risks spread across an entire day and night. Still, you kept the possibility in reserve, mentally, throughout today's careful work at the stone, aware that circumstances might yet force your hand toward that more direct, more dangerous alternative if the wall and passage ultimately failed to provide genuine escape. You're grateful now, reflecting on it from the relative safety of this quiet cottage, that circumstances never actually required you to test that particular reserve plan. Patience and careful observation, in the end, proved sufficient without demanding the kind of direct confrontation that alternative would have required. It remains, regardless, a useful reminder of exactly how many different paths you considered throughout that long, careful day, each one weighed honestly against its genuine risks and possibilities before you settled, finally, on the route that actually carried you to safety. By midday, a new sound reaches your cell, faint but unmistakable once you identify it, carried on whatever wind happens to be moving today. Hammering, steady, and rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the direction of the town square. You know immediately what it means without needing anyone to confirm it. The priest mentioned it plainly enough this morning. Somewhere above and beyond this cell, ordinary carpenters are finishing an ordinary piece of construction, built with the same practical competence they'd bring to any other job, indifferent, or at least professionally detached from the specific purpose this particular structure will serve tomorrow at dawn. It's a strange thing, hearing your own execution being built in real time, each hammer strike a small, undeniable confirmation that tomorrow is approaching with genuine, physical certainty, rather than remaining some abstract future threat you might still talk your way out of. You force yourself to sit with the sound rather than flinch from it, treating it deliberately as information rather than horror. It tells you, at minimum, that preparations are proceeding on schedule, that nobody currently doubts tomorrow's outcome enough to delay anything, and that whatever window remains for you to act is shrinking at precisely the same steady rhythm as that distant hammering. A part of you wants to press your hands over your ears and simply wait for the sound to stop. You don't allow yourself that particular comfort. Instead, you count the strikes, an old habit reasserting itself even here, converting fear into something closer to a measurement. Another rough estimate of how much daylight remains before this construction, presumably, finishes for the day. The hammering continues steadily for a while longer, then eventually fades. The carpenters, apparently satisfied with today's progress, off now to whatever else fills their ordinary afternoon. You breathe out slowly once the sound stops entirely, feeling your own pulse gradually settle, and return your attention deliberately to the crack in the wall waiting patiently across the cell. You weren't always a prisoner here, and that distinction, small as it might seem now, matters considerably more than your captors probably realize. Before whatever circumstance led to this cell, you passed through this keep more than once, delivering goods, running errands for a merchant whose business occasionally required dealing with the Lord's household directly. You never had reason then to memorize its layout with any particular care, but ordinary observation, gathered casually across several visits, has left you with more useful knowledge than a stranger arriving here for the first time would ever possess. You remember, vaguely but usefully, that the keep's oldest section, the part your cell almost certainly backs onto, was largely abandoned. When the current Lord's grandfather expanded the fortifications a generation ago, rather than demolish the old stonework entirely, builders simply incorporated what remained into the newer structure, sealing off passages that no longer served any obvious purpose, rather than clearing them away completely. You remember, too, a servant once complaining, within your hearing, though not directly to you, about strange drafts in certain lower corridors, air moving through gaps nobody could quite explain. Evidence, you suspect now, of old passages still connected somewhere to the outside world, however indirectly. None of this constitutes anything resembling a map. It's fragments, half-remembered details gathered without any specific purpose at the time, now suddenly, urgently relevant in a way you never could have anticipated when you first heard them. You try, as carefully as memory allows, to reconstruct roughly where your current cell sits relative to those old rumored passages, working from the little you recall of this keep's general shape. The position of the old tower, visible briefly during your walk down here under guard. It's imprecise. It's also, genuinely, more than most prisoners in your position would ever have available to them. You press your palm once more against the crumbling crack in the wall, feeling its rough edge, and allow yourself, cautiously, to believe the geography actually favors you here, however slightly. Around midday, the corridor outside briefly grows busier than usual, footsteps overlapping, voices exchanging the particular clipped small talk of men handing responsibility from one shift to the next. You listen carefully, cataloging what you can from sound alone. 2 guards, perhaps 3, more voices than you typically hear during the quieter stretches of morning or late afternoon. A brief joke, half heard, followed by low laughter. The particular scrape of a chair being adjusted near the corridor's near end, where guards apparently take turns sitting when duty allows a moment's rest. This is useful, though not in any way that offers an immediate opportunity. Midday's guard change brings more men, not fewer, more eyes, rather than a helpful gap. But it confirms something you've suspected from your earlier counting. Shift changes create brief windows of overlapping attention and distraction. Guards focused on handing off duties and exchanging information rather than watching your door with their full concentration. If midday's crowded handover is any indication, tonight's larger rotation, the one both the priest and the jailer mentioned separately, will likely bring an even greater window of distraction. New faces, still learning this specific corridor's habits. Established guards perhaps less careful in their final moments before finishing a long shift. You note this carefully, adding it to the small collection of details you've gathered today. The pacing guard's rhythm, the priest's mention of tonight's rotation, the jailer's comment about an unfamiliar new captain, and now this, direct evidence that shift changes genuinely do create a period of reduced attention, however briefly. The corridor gradually quiets again as the new shift settles into its routine, footsteps returning to their familiar, predictable rhythm. You allow yourself a small measure of satisfaction at how much you've already learned simply through patient listening, though you remind yourself firmly that knowledge alone has never yet opened a locked door. Today, eventually, it will need to become action. In the early afternoon, an unexpected sound reaches you through the small barred opening in your door. A whisper, deliberately quiet, clearly meant only for you. You move closer carefully, recognizing after a moment the voice of a young, stable hand you vaguely remember from your earlier visits to this keep. A boy you once did a small kindness for, sharing bread on a cold delivery day when he'd had none of his own. He doesn't linger long, aware, clearly, of exactly how much risk even this brief exchange carries for him. He tells you little, and quickly, words tumbling out in a rushed undertone. The old servants' passage near the kitchens, the one everyone assumes has been sealed for years, isn't quite as sealed as officially claimed. A section near the wine cellar was reopened briefly last winter for repairs and never properly closed again, simply boarded over loosely by workers who saw little point in finishing a job nobody was paying close attention to. He mentions, too, that tonight's new guard captain, arriving with the larger rotation, has a reputation for strict discipline, but limited patience. A man likely to keep his newer guards busy with formal duties rather than allowing them the easier familiarity established staff have developed with this keep's actual, practical routines. Then he's gone, footsteps hurrying away before anyone notices how long he's lingered near your door. You sit back, turning this new information over carefully alongside everything else you've gathered today. A weakened section of wall in your own cell. A larger, more chaotic guard rotation coming tonight. A jailer's passing comment about the incoming captain's unfamiliarity with older passages. And now this. Direct confirmation that at least one of those old passages remains more accessible than official records would suggest. It isn't a complete plan yet, but the pieces, gathered separately throughout an otherwise ordinary day of waiting, are beginning finally, to resemble something that might actually work. You allow yourself, for the first time since waking in this cell, something closer to genuine cautious hope than simple stubborn refusal to accept your sentence. Among the various fragments of your old life you've turned over repeatedly during your time in this cell, one keeps surfacing with particular persistence. A debt owed to you, rather than by you, from a blacksmith in the town whose work you once helped protect from a dishonest business partner. It's a small thing, in the grand scheme of your current circumstances, and you have no direct way of calling on it from inside a locked cell. But it matters for a different reason. It reminds you, deliberately, that your position in this town before your arrest wasn't entirely without allies, however modest, however unlikely to risk themselves openly on your behalf. The blacksmith won't storm this keep for you. Nobody sensible would expect that, and you don't either. But a man who owes a genuine debt sometimes finds smaller, safer ways to repay it. A word passed quietly to the right person, a door left unlocked that should have been secured, a moment's convenient distraction offered without ever needing to explain exactly why. You have no way of confirming, from inside this cell, whether any of that is actually happening beyond these walls today. But the possibility itself matters. A reminder that whatever's unfolding tonight may not rest entirely on your own actions alone. That a life lived with at least some decency toward others sometimes returns dividends precisely when they're needed most. You allow yourself a brief, quiet memory of the blacksmith's grateful handshake after that old dispute was settled in his favor, his promise, half joking at the time, that he'd remember the favor if it ever mattered. It's a small thread of hope, thin and entirely unconfirmed. But thin threads, gathered alongside enough others, sometimes prove sufficient to hold real weight. You return your attention to the crumbling crack in your cell wall, working now with renewed determination, hoping that whatever help might exist beyond these stones arrives at roughly the same hour your own efforts finally bear fruit. Somewhere in the early afternoon, examining your cell door for what feels like the 100th time since arriving, you notice something you'd previously overlooked. The lower hinge, half hidden by shadow and grime, carries considerably more rust than its upper counterpart. It makes a kind of practical sense once you consider it properly. Water seeping down from the damp lower wall has spent years working against this specific point far more aggressively than the drier stone higher up. The upper hinge remains solid, unremarkable. The lower one, when you press against it experimentally, gives very slightly a small but genuine flex that shouldn't exist in metal meant to hold a door this heavy secure. You test it again, more carefully this time, aware of how much noise even a small effort might create in a corridor where a guard could pass at any moment. The give is minimal, nowhere near enough on its own to free the door from its frame, but combined with sufficient force at precisely the right angle, applied at exactly the right moment, when no one's listening closely, it might matter considerably more than its small size suggests. You think back to the crack in the far wall, already partially widened through your earlier careful work, and begin turning over, deliberately, which route actually offers better odds. Continuing to work the old stone wall toward whatever half-remembered passage lies beyond it, or focusing effort instead on this weakened hinge, a more direct route. through the door itself, if it can be persuaded to fail at the right moment. Neither option is simple, neither is remotely guaranteed, but having two possible weaknesses rather than one feels, suddenly, considerably better than the single uncertain hope you woke up with this morning. You decide, carefully, to continue working both simultaneously as the day allows, the wall during quieter stretches when a guard's footsteps aren't audible, the hinge in shorter bursts when you can risk the small sound testing it inevitably requires. Two paths forward, however uncertain each remains individually, feel considerably better than a single narrow hope. You return to the crack in the stone, working now with a steadier, more methodical patience than you managed even an hour ago. Working steadily at the stone, your mind drifts, as it periodically has throughout this long day, to the ordinary life this entire situation has interrupted so abruptly. You think of a small room above a shop, nothing grand, simply yours, in a way this cell will never be, no matter how long you're forced to occupy it. You think of a particular meal, unremarkable in any objective sense, shared with people who mattered to you. The kind of evening you never once thought to properly appreciate while it was actually happening. The way most ordinary evenings go entirely unnoticed until circumstances make their absence suddenly, sharply obvious. There's a risk in this kind of remembering. You're aware. A danger of softening exactly when you most need to stay hard and focused. But there's usefulness in it too. A reminder of precisely what you're working this hard to return to. Motivation sharper and more immediate than simple, abstract fear of death ever quite manages to provide on its own. You allow yourself a few more minutes of this before deliberately setting it aside, returning your full attention to the practical task at hand. Sentiment, you remind yourself firmly, has never yet loosened a single stone from a wall. Only patient, careful effort manages that. Still, the memory lingers usefully at the edges of your concentration, a quiet reminder of stakes worth genuinely fighting for, rather than simply escaping death in the abstract. A room, a meal, ordinary people who'd notice and grieve if tomorrow's arrangement proceeds as currently planned. You press your palm once more against the loosening stone, feeling grit shift slightly beneath renewed pressure, and continue working with a determination that feels, now, considerably more personal than it did even an hour earlier. Whatever happens tonight, you intend for it to be worth exactly as much effort as that quiet, unremarkable memory deserves. As afternoon wears on, a different guard takes over the corridor, someone you've observed less thoroughly than the earlier pacing man, though careful attention now reveals habits of his own worth noting. This one moves more quickly between passes, less inclined toward the lingering pause near the corridor's window that the earlier guard favored. But he compensates for that faster rhythm with a different vulnerability. Roughly twice each hour, he steps briefly away from the corridor entirely, presumably toward whatever privy or refreshment the guards use during their shift, absent for a count of perhaps 60 breaths before returning. You've timed this pattern as carefully as you managed the earlier guard's rhythm, counting silently each time, cross-referencing the rough intervals against whatever other markers of time you can gather. 60 breaths isn't long. It's also not nothing. A window during which this specific stretch of corridor stands genuinely unwatched. Combined with the larger disruption expected during tonight's full rotation change, this smaller, more frequent gap offers something additionally useful: confirmation that guards in this specific corridor are not, in fact, watched as continuously or carefully as their employer likely believes. Human habit, need, and simple boredom create small gaps in even well-intentioned vigilance, gaps that accumulate across an entire day into genuine opportunity for anyone patient enough to notice and measure them properly. You continue your work at the stone during his absences specifically, timing your louder, more effortful moments of pressure to coincide with exactly those brief windows when no one stands close enough to hear. It's slow, careful, occasionally frustrating work, progress measured in small increments rather than any dramatic single breakthrough. But slow and careful today is precisely what the situation actually calls for. You wipe sweat and dust from your hands, listening for the guard's returning footsteps, and settle back against the wall to wait for his next predictable absence. The light through your small barred window has shifted considerably since morning, and you recognize, from its lower, more golden angle, that afternoon is finally beginning its long slide toward evening. This matters enormously. Every plan you've assembled throughout today, every scrap of overheard information, every careful measurement of guard, rhythm, and habit has been building deliberately toward tonight's larger rotation change, the one moment when disruption, distraction, and unfamiliarity combine into something genuinely resembling opportunity. You allow yourself a brief accounting of the day's progress. The crack in the wall has widened considerably, though not yet enough to offer a genuine path through. The lower hinge remains a secondary possibility, tested but not yet properly exploited. The stable boy's information about the old servant's passage near the wine cellar remains unconfirmed by anything beyond his own hurried whisper, though you have little reason to doubt a boy who took real risk simply passing along the message. The hammering from the town square has resumed briefly once more this afternoon, a final few strikes suggesting the gallows construction is very nearly complete, a detail you note with grim clarity, rather than allowing it to overwhelm your focus entirely. You eat the last of today's bread slowly, deliberately, aware that whatever strength you'll need tonight depends partly on whatever meager nourishment you've been given throughout this long, careful day of watching and waiting. Outside, beyond stone walls you cannot see through, the ordinary business of the castle continues its own unhurried rhythm toward evening. Somewhere, cooks are preparing whatever meal the household expects tonight. Somewhere, guards not yet on duty are perhaps resting briefly before their own shift begins. Somewhere, a new captain unfamiliar with this keep's older passages is presumably making his own final preparations before taking command of tonight's rotation. None of them know yet how carefully today has been spent inside this particular cell. You settle back against the cold stone, watching the light continue its slow retreat, and begin, deliberately, gathering whatever remains of your strength and focus for whatever the coming hours actually demand. As the afternoon light continues its slow retreat toward evening, a new element enters your careful calculations: the distinct, unmistakable smell of rain approaching, carried faintly through your cell's small barred window on a shifting, cooling breeze. You consider this new development carefully, weighing its various implications. Rain, you know from ordinary experience, tends to quiet a castle's outdoor activity considerably, guards seeking whatever shelter their posts allow rather than maintaining the same alert, exposed vigilance they'd offer in clear weather. It also, less helpfully, tends to make climbing and outdoor navigation considerably more treacherous. Wet stone and slick grass working against exactly the kind of careful, controlled movement tonight's escape will require. You weigh these competing factors as thoroughly as the situation allows. On balance, you decide, cautiously, that rain likely favors you more than it hinders you. Guards' reduced attentiveness, outweighing the additional physical difficulty it introduces, particularly if the rain remains light rather than becoming a genuine storm. The smell grows gradually stronger as the afternoon continues, and eventually a distant rumble of thunder confirms your suspicion. Weather moving in from somewhere beyond the keep's walls, indifferent, as weather always is, to whatever human drama happens to be unfolding beneath it. You listen to the first scattered drops begin striking the stone above your cell, an uneven, gentle percussion that gradually strengthens into something steadier. Somewhere above, you imagine guards adjusting their posts, seeking whatever meager shelter the castle's outer walls provide. Attention divided now between their duty and their own simple discomfort. It's a small thing, this weather, but you add it carefully to everything else you've gathered today. One more factor shaping your understanding of exactly how tonight's escape might reasonably unfold. You settle back against the cold stone, listening to the steadying rain, and allow yourself a brief, grim satisfaction that even the sky itself seems, tonight, inclined to offer you some small advantage. As evening properly settles in, the older jailer returns once more, this time carrying something slightly more substantial than the day's earlier meager rations, a proper meal of sorts, the kind occasionally offered to condemned men on their final night, whether from genuine tradition or some vague institutional sense of obligation. Nobody bothers examining too closely. There's bread, fresher than this morning's, a small portion of meat, a cup of something closer to actual wine than the watered version typically offered. He sets it down without much ceremony, the same faint discomfort in his manner as always, a man performing an unpleasant duty as gently as the duty itself allows. You thank him, quietly, genuinely, aware that whatever small kindness this represents costs him nothing, but still required him to remember, and to care enough to remember, that a condemned man's final night might reasonably include one decent meal. He lingers a moment longer than strictly necessary, and mentions, seemingly without particular purpose, that tonight's new captain has already proven exactly as strict and unfamiliar as rumored, currently occupying most of his attention with formal inspection of the main gate and outer walls rather than the older, less obviously important lower corridors. It's another small, useful detail, offered perhaps without full awareness of its usefulness, joining everything else you've gathered throughout this long day. You eat slowly, deliberately, savoring what might genuinely be your last proper meal, while simultaneously using the time to continue quietly planning. The meat is tough, but welcome. The bread is good. The wine, weak as it likely is compared to what wealthier men enjoy, still offers a brief, genuine warmth against the cell's persistent chill. The jailer takes the empty cup and plate when you're finished, offers a brief nod that might, in a different circumstance, have passed for genuine sympathy and leaves you once more alone with the deepening dark. You listen to his footsteps fade down the corridor and begin immediately the final careful preparations for whatever the night still holds. Later, as full evening settles over the keep, a final visitor arrives at your door, a minor official, tasked apparently with confirming your identity one last time before tomorrow's arrangements. A bureaucratic formality that seems almost absurd given the circumstances. He asks the expected questions, confirms your name, your alleged offense, whether you have any final statement you'd like formally recorded before the sentence is carried out. You answer carefully, giving him exactly enough to satisfy the requirement without revealing anything of your actual current state of mind. It would be easy, in this moment, to protest your innocence loudly, to demand reconsideration, to beg for mercy you have no genuine reason to expect will arrive. You consider it briefly, then deliberately set the impulse aside. Nothing about tonight's careful planning benefits from drawing additional attention to yourself, from seeming anything other than the quietly resigned prisoner everyone currently assumes you to be. Instead, you offer a brief, measured statement, something vague about accepting whatever judgment has been made, careful words designed specifically to sound like resignation, rather than the focused determination actually occupying your thoughts. The official nods, apparently satisfied, makes a brief note, and departs without further comment. It's a small act of deliberate performance, but an important one. Whatever happens in the coming hours depends partly on nobody suspecting, until it's already too late to prevent, that tonight's condemned prisoner has spent his entire final day doing considerably more than simply waiting quietly for morning. You listen to his footsteps recede, then allow yourself, finally, full concentration on the practical work still remaining. The crack in the wall, the weakened hinge. The stable boy's information about the old passage near the wine cellar, the guard rotation's timing, now only a few hours away. Full darkness is settling properly now, beyond your small barred window. Whatever this night actually holds is close enough now to feel genuinely in the careful, steady rhythm of your own patient breathing. Full dark arrives gradually, then all at once, the way it always does in a season without much lingering twilight, and with it comes a shift in the castle's ordinary rhythm that you've been anticipating throughout this entire long day. The corridor outside grows quieter in the particular way that suggests fewer people moving through it. Torches lit now at wider intervals, their flickering light barely reaching beneath your door's small barred opening. Somewhere above, you can hear the faint suggestion of the household settling into evening routine, voices lower, footsteps less frequent, the ordinary business of daylight, giving way to whatever quieter tasks occupy a castle after dark. You've spent the last of the daylight hours finishing what preparation you reasonably can. The crack in the wall has widened enough now that you believe, cautiously, a determined effort might finally open a genuine gap, though you won't know for certain until you properly test it. The lower hinge remains a secondary option, tested enough to know it might give under sufficient pressure, though you have no way of predicting exactly how much noise that final effort will require. You wait now, deliberately, for the sound you've been anticipating since the priest first mentioned it this morning. The larger disruption of tonight's full guard rotation, new voices, unfamiliar footsteps, the particular chaos of an inexperienced captain settling his men into positions they don't yet fully understand. It arrives eventually, muffled through stone and distance, but unmistakable once you focus properly on it. Raised voices somewhere down the corridor, the scrape of boots moving in numbers greater than the ordinary single guard's steady pace, someone giving orders in a tone that suggests unfamiliarity with exactly how this specific corridor's routine normally proceeds. This is it, you understand immediately. Whatever window tonight offers, it's beginning now. You press yourself against the wall beside the weakened crack, take one final steadying breath, and begin, at last, the careful, quiet work of actually leaving this cell behind. You work at the crack with steady, deliberate pressure, timing each effort carefully against the confused, overlapping voices still audible from the corridor's ongoing rotation change. Progress comes slowly at first, small pieces of loosened mortar and stone falling away with barely a sound, caught mostly in your own waiting palm rather than allowed to strike the floor and risk unwanted noise. You work methodically, patiently, resisting the urge to rush despite every instinct screaming at you that time is running out with each passing minute. Then, gradually, a larger section shifts, enough that you can finally see, in the dim light filtering through your small window, an actual gap beginning to open behind the crumbling stone, darker still beyond it, suggesting genuine open space rather than simply more solid wall. Your pulse quickens, though you force your breathing to remain steady, aware that excitement now, however justified, serves you far less than continued careful patience. You work at the edges of the widening gap, testing its size against your own shoulders, aware that a passage too narrow to actually fit through would represent the cruelest possible outcome after this much careful effort. It's tight. It's genuinely, uncomfortably tight, stone scraping against your shoulders as you test the opening's actual width. But it's passable, you determine after a long, careful moment of consideration, provided you're willing to accept some scraped skin and considerable discomfort in exchange for what lies beyond. You pause, listening once more toward the corridor, confirming the confused rotation change still occupies whatever attention might otherwise be directed toward the quieter sounds coming from inside your cell. The moment feels, suddenly, entirely real in a way that hours of careful planning somehow hadn't quite managed to convey. You press your palm one final time against the wall's rough edge, take a steadying breath, and begin, carefully, working your way into the darkness beyond. The space beyond the wall is tighter and darker than anything you'd properly prepared yourself for. Cold stone pressing close on every side, the air thick with dust that's clearly gone undisturbed for a very long time. You move slowly, one careful hand extended ahead of you, feeling for the passage's actual shape in total darkness. The small light from your cell already fading behind you as you advance deeper into whatever this old, abandoned section of the keep actually consists of. The stable boy's whispered information mentioned a connection somewhere toward the wine cellar, though he offered no specific directions beyond that single rough detail. You're navigating now almost entirely by instinct and careful memory of this keep's general layout, gathered from your occasional visits here long before any of this began. The passage narrows further at one point, forcing you to turn sideways, stones scraping uncomfortably against your chest and back as you push through the tightest section yet. For one genuinely frightening moment, you wonder whether you've misjudged this entirely, whether this old passage simply dead-ends somewhere ahead into solid stone with no actual connection to anywhere useful at all. Then, gradually, the air changes, growing slightly less stale, carrying the faint suggestion of something else entirely, the distinct, unmistakable smell of wine and damp cellar stone, confirmation that you're approaching, however slowly, somewhere genuinely connected to the rest of this castle's working spaces. You press forward with renewed determination, ignoring the discomfort of stone against skin, focusing entirely on that faint, promising smell, growing gradually stronger as you continue. Somewhere ahead, faint and distant but growing steadily clearer, you begin to make out the suggestion of actual light, the first genuine sign since entering this passage that it leads somewhere other than simply deeper into forgotten darkness. You quicken your careful pace toward it, heart beating steadily faster with each cautious step forward. Partway through the tight, dark passage beyond your cell wall, something small and quick brushes suddenly against your ankle, and you freeze completely. Heart lurching sharply before your mind properly identifies the sensation. A rat, almost certainly, startled from whatever quiet nest it's built somewhere in this long abandoned stretch of stone, fleeing now in its own small panic deeper into the passage's darkness ahead of you. You force yourself to breathe evenly, aware that the sudden fright cost you several precious seconds of frozen stillness you can't genuinely afford to repeat. It's an unpleasant reminder, regardless, of exactly how little you can actually see or anticipate in this total darkness, how much you're relying on touch and rough memory, rather than any genuine certainty about what this passage actually contains. You continue more slowly for a moment, one hand extended carefully ahead, alert now to the possibility of further small startles waiting somewhere in the blackness surrounding you. Nothing else disturbs you as you continue, though the earlier fright lingers uncomfortably at the edges of your concentration, a reminder that fear, even over something as small and ultimately harmless as a startled rat, can undo careful composure with startling speed if you allow it to. You steady your breathing deliberately, drawing on the same patient discipline that carried you through this entire long day of careful waiting and observation, and press forward once more, focused entirely now on the faint, promising smell of wine and cellar stone growing gradually stronger somewhere ahead. The passage narrows once more, briefly, before widening again, and you continue, steadier now. Having weathered this small, unexpected fright without losing the composure, the remainder of tonight's escape will continue to demand from you. The passage finally opens, after what feels like considerably longer than it likely actually was, into a low stone chamber lined with wine casks, faint torchlight visible through a gap in a door at the chamber's far end. You pause here, breathing carefully, allowing your eyes a moment to adjust properly after the total darkness of the passage behind you. The stable boy's information proves accurate, at least this far. This is genuinely the wine cellar, exactly as he described, the loosely boarded section he mentioned, now visible as a rough gap in the stonework you've just emerged through, clearly patched hastily rather than properly sealed during whatever repair work happened here last winter. You take a moment, deliberately, to steady your nerves before continuing. The hardest part, you suspect, still lies ahead, navigating through occupied sections of the castle rather than this fortunate stretch of forgotten passage. Avoiding whatever guards and servants might still be moving through corridors between here and any genuine path outside these walls. You listen carefully at the chamber's far door, catching faint sounds beyond it, distant voices, the ordinary business of a castle kitchen still functioning even at this hour. Pots and preparations for tomorrow's larger-than-usual crowd, the same crowd currently expected to witness your execution rather than instead discovering your absence. You steady yourself once more, running through, quickly, everything you've gathered throughout this long day. The new captain's unfamiliarity with older passages, the reduced attention during tonight's chaotic rotation, whatever quiet assistance the blacksmith's old debt might or might not actually provide somewhere beyond these walls. None of it guarantees anything from here forward. But you've come further already tonight than you had any right to expect this morning, waking to what everyone assumed was simply your final day. You press yourself close against the chamber's shadowed edge, watching the doors gap carefully for movement, and prepare yourself for whatever comes next. You move through the wine cellar's far door carefully, finding yourself in a narrow service corridor clearly connected to the castle's working kitchens, judging by the warm, smoky air and distant clatter of pots and voices somewhere ahead. This is considerably more dangerous ground than the forgotten passage behind you, occupied space rather than abandoned stone. Real risk of encountering a servant or guard at any moment rather than simply navigating empty darkness. You move slowly, deliberately, staying close to the wall, alert to every sound ahead. A servant passes at one point, close enough that you flatten yourself instinctively into a shadowed alcove, holding your breath entirely until her footsteps fade safely past. She doesn't notice you, occupied entirely with whatever task currently demands her attention, carrying something toward the kitchens without a backward glance in your direction. You continue forward once the corridor clears again, following what you hope, based on rough memory of this keep's general layout, leads eventually toward the outer courtyard rather than deeper into the castle's more heavily populated central sections. The kitchen's noise grows briefly louder as you pass a connecting doorway, glimpsing, for one brief unguarded moment, cooks and servants moving through their ordinary evening routine, entirely unaware of the escaped prisoner passing so close by in the shadows, just beyond their attention. You press on, quickening your pace slightly now that the immediate danger has passed, following the corridor's gradual slope downward and outward, trusting the rough sense of direction you've maintained since first entering the old passage behind your cell. Cold night air reaches you eventually, faint but unmistakable, carrying with it the distinct promise of open space somewhere not too much further ahead. You allow yourself, cautiously, a small measure of genuine hope, though you remind yourself firmly that the courtyard itself, once you reach it, will present entirely new dangers of its own. The corridor finally opens into a shadowed edge of the castle's outer courtyard, cold night air striking you properly for the first time since this morning, carrying with it both genuine relief and immediate, sharpened awareness of new danger. Torches burn at intervals around the courtyard's perimeter, throwing uneven light across cobblestones and casting long, shifting shadows that could easily conceal a watching guard as readily as they conceal you. You press yourself into the darkest available shadow, taking stock carefully, before attempting to move any further. Somewhere across the courtyard, you can make out the stables, dark shapes of horses occasionally shifting audibly within, and beyond that, the outer wall itself, considerably more imposing now that you're actually facing the prospect of somehow getting past or over it, rather than simply planning abstractly from the safety of a locked cell. A guard passes along the courtyard's far edge, his pace unhurried, apparently unaware of anything amiss. Part of the ordinary routine patrol this castle maintains regardless of what's happening in any particular cell below. You wait perfectly still until his footsteps fade toward the courtyard's opposite corner before allowing yourself to move again. You think, briefly, of the stable boy who passed you, that crucial whispered information earlier today, wondering whether he's somewhere nearby even now, whether his earlier risk on your behalf might extend further. Should you actually encounter him again in the stables ahead? You move carefully along the courtyard's shadowed edge, staying close to the wall, timing each small advance against the patrolling guard's rhythm. The same careful patience that guided you through this entire long day, now serving you at what feels like its most critical moment yet. The stables draw closer with each careful step, and beyond them, distantly visible even in darkness, the outer wall itself, your final, most difficult obstacle standing between this courtyard and genuine freedom. In the immediate aftermath of clearing the wall, before the forest properly swallows you into its deeper darkness, you experience a strange, brief hour unlike anything else this entire extraordinary day has offered. You are neither fully safe nor fully hunted in this particular stretch of time, the castle behind you still apparently unaware of your absence. Whatever search will eventually organize itself, not yet begun. You move quickly, but not yet in true, desperate flight, your body still processing the sheer improbability of having actually cleared that wall after everything the day demanded to reach this point. The night air feels different out here than it did even in the courtyard moments earlier, wider somehow, carrying scents of open field and distant woodland rather than stone and torch smoke. You allow yourself, briefly, small moments of something almost like wonder amid the urgency, noticing details you'd have had no capacity to appreciate during the tenser stretches of tonight's escape. The particular quality of moonlight on dew-damp grass, the distant call of some night bird you can't immediately identify, the simple, overwhelming fact of open sky stretching uninterrupted overhead after so many days confined beneath low stone ceilings. This strange, suspended hour doesn't last. Practical urgency reasserts itself soon enough, the need to put genuine distance between yourself and the castle, before any search begins outweighing whatever brief wonder the open night offers. But you carry that small window of experience with you regardless. A reminder, even during the more desperate hours of forest and river still ahead, of exactly what you're actually running toward, rather than simply what you're fleeing. Freedom. You're already beginning to understand, even in this earliest hour of possessing it, isn't only the absence of the cell and the gallows, it's also, quietly, everything the world still contains that a locked room simply couldn't offer you, however briefly you're currently able to properly notice and appreciate it. You quicken your pace again, the forest drawing closer ahead, this brief, suspended hour of quiet wonder giving way once more to necessary, careful urgency. You reach the stable's shadowed entrance without further incident, slipping inside quickly, grateful for the relative darkness and the warm, familiar smell of hay and horses after the tense open exposure of crossing the courtyard. A soft sound alerts you before you fully register its source. The stable boy, the same one who passed you that crucial whisper through your cell door earlier today, standing near one of the stalls with an expression that shifts rapidly from surprise to something closer to relief. He doesn't waste time on unnecessary questions, understanding immediately, from your appearance alone, exactly what's happened since his earlier message reached you. He gestures urgently toward a smaller side door, one used typically for moving feed and equipment, rather than the main stable entrance guards more routinely watch. He whispers quickly that the outer wall's watch has thinned somewhat tonight. Guards redistributed partly toward the main gate, where the new captain has focused most of his attention, exactly as the jailer mentioned earlier over your evening meal. A section of wall near the old tower, he adds, has scaffolding still standing from recent repair work, offering, if you're careful and reasonably strong, an actual climbable route over rather than through the fortification itself. You thank him quickly, genuinely, aware of exactly how much risk he's already taken twice now on your behalf. He waves off the gratitude, urging you instead toward the side door, clearly anxious to see you gone before anyone notices either of you standing here together. You slip through the door, he indicated, emerging into a narrow gap between the stables and the outer wall itself, the old tower and its promised scaffolding visible now, dark and looming, a short distance ahead. Your legs feel suddenly heavier, with accumulated exhaustion and tension, the whole day's careful effort converging now into this single remaining obstacle. You steady your breathing, fix your eyes on the scaffolding ahead, and begin moving toward it as quickly as caution reasonably allows. The old tower's repair scaffolding rises unevenly against the outer wall, wooden poles lashed together with rope that's seen better days, clearly meant for workmen rather than anyone attempting a hurried nighttime climb. You test the first section carefully before committing your full weight, aware that a collapse now, this close to genuine freedom, would end everything as surely as any guard's blade. It holds, creaking slightly but steady enough, and you begin climbing with careful, deliberate movements, each handhold tested before you trust it fully. The height grows quickly more apparent as you ascend, courtyard torches shrinking below into small, distant points of flickering light. Wind catches you more directly here, cold and sharp after the relative stillness of the passages and courtyard below, carrying with it the distant, muffled sounds of a castle still largely unaware of your absence. Halfway up, a guard's voice calls out somewhere below, sharp and questioning, and you freeze completely, pressing yourself as flat as the scaffolding allows against the wall's rough stone. Your heart pounds fiercely in your chest, waiting for the shout that would mean discovery, for boots rushing toward the tower's base. It doesn't come. The voice, after a tense, silent moment, resolves into something more casual. A guard apparently calling to a companion rather than raising any actual alarm. The ordinary business of a routine patrol, rather than anything related to you specifically. You allow yourself a slow, careful breath, then continue climbing, more cautiously still, toward the scaffolding's uppermost section, where it meets the wall's actual parapet. The top comes eventually, cold stone beneath your hands, the wall's outer edge visible just beyond, and beyond that, dark and vast and entirely unguarded in this exact moment, the open countryside stretching away from this castle that very nearly became the last place you'd ever know. You swing yourself carefully over the parapet's edge, lowering your body along the outer face of the wall, using whatever remaining scaffolding extends down this side, considerably rougher and less secure than the climb up had been. The drop, when the scaffolding finally runs out several feet above the ground, is manageable though far from comfortable, and you land awkwardly in the shadow of the wall. Pain shooting briefly through one ankle before settling into something you judge cautiously to be nothing worse than a minor twist rather than any genuine break. You allow yourself only a moment to catch your breath before moving, aware that lingering here, directly beneath the wall you've just descended, remains among the most dangerous places you could possibly choose to rest. You limp quickly toward the tree line visible a short distance ahead, dark and irregular against the slightly lighter night sky, offering the first genuine cover since leaving the stables behind. Behind you, the castle remains largely quiet, no shouts of alarm yet, no sudden torches converging toward the section of wall you've just escaped over. Whatever fortune has carried you this far seems, for now, to be holding. You reach the tree line and allow yourself, finally, a single look back at the keep that so nearly became your entire world's final boundary. Torchlight flickers steadily along its walls, the ordinary rhythm of nighttime patrol continuing exactly as it has throughout this entire long day, entirely unaware, still, of what's just happened. Along its outer edge, you turn away from it deliberately, facing instead the dark, uncertain countryside stretching ahead, and begin moving as quickly as your slightly injured ankle reasonably allows. Freedom, you understand clearly even in this first exhausted moment of achieving it, isn't the same thing as safety. The castle behind you will discover your absence eventually, likely by morning at the very latest, and whatever search follows will begin, in all probability, precisely at first light. You have hours, perhaps, before that happens. You intend to use every single one of them, putting as much distance as possible between yourself and everything this night has so narrowly allowed you to escape. The forest closes around you within a few dozen paces, trees thickening quickly enough that the castle's distant torchlight disappears almost entirely behind you, replaced by a darkness considerably deeper and more disorienting than anything you experienced, even in the old passage beneath your cell. You move as quickly as caution allows, one hand extended slightly ahead to catch low branches before they strike your face, your injured ankle protesting steadily now that the adrenaline of the wall's descent has begun, gradually, to fade. Every sound around you, the rustle of small animals, wind moving through leaves overhead, seems momentarily indistinguishable from pursuit, forcing you to pause repeatedly, listening carefully before continuing. You have no clear map of this countryside, only rough general knowledge gathered from occasional merchant deliveries in this direction long before any of today's circumstances began. You know, roughly, that a river runs somewhere to the east, that a scattering of small villages lies beyond it, communities distant enough from the keep's direct authority that word of an escaped prisoner might not reach them for at least a day or two if it reaches them at all, before you've had time to disappear properly into whatever anonymity they might offer. You navigate as best you can by the stars visible occasionally through gaps in the forest canopy, an old, rough method, but the only one genuinely available to you tonight. The going is slow, exhausting, considerably harder than the careful, patient waiting that occupied most of today. This new phase of your escape demanding a different kind of endurance, entirely.
You allow yourself brief pauses only when genuinely necessary, catching your breath against a tree trunk, listening carefully behind you for any sign of pursuit before continuing onward.
The forest seems endless in the darkness, each stretch of trees indistinguishable from the last, though you trust, cautiously, that steady eastward progress must eventually bring you to that rumored river. And whatever safety might exist somewhere beyond it, you press on, exhaustion mounting steadily, driven forward by the simple, overwhelming fact that stopping now, however briefly, feels considerably more dangerous than continuing, despite the pain in your ankle and the weariness settling deep into every remaining muscle. Somewhere behind you, though you have no direct way of confirming it yet, the castle's absence of alarm cannot possibly last through the entire remaining night. You imagine, as you continue moving steadily through the dark forest, roughly how discovery will likely unfold. A guard, perhaps during the change of watch nearest dawn, checking your cell as routine dictates, finding it empty, the crumbling gap in the wall immediately obvious to anyone actually looking directly at it. Alarm raised quickly after that, the new captain's strict discipline turning suddenly useful for organizing a proper search, rather than simply intimidating his own unfamiliar guards. You have no way of knowing, from inside this dark forest, exactly how much time you've actually gained. It might be hours yet before anyone discovers your absence. It might be considerably less if some unlucky guard happens to check your corridor sooner than the routine schedule would typically dictate. You push yourself to move faster despite your protesting ankle, aware that every additional mile between yourself and that keep matters considerably more than any brief rest your exhausted body currently craves. At one point, you believe you hear something behind you, a distant sound that might be voices, might simply be wind moving through distant trees, might be nothing at all beyond your own frightened imagination, working overtime in the darkness. You freeze, listening intently, heart pounding, until the sound, whatever it actually was, fades without repeating. You continue more cautiously after that, moving with slightly more care to keep your own noise minimal, aware that whatever pursuit eventually organizes itself will likely include men who know this countryside considerably better than you currently do. Trackers, perhaps, or simply local guards familiar with every rough path a fleeing prisoner might reasonably choose. The forest offers you cover, but it offers the same cover to anyone hunting through it as well. You press onward regardless, trusting that distance and darkness together remain, for now, your best available allies. The forest finally begins thinning as the eastern sky shows the first faint suggestion of approaching dawn. And with it, at last, the sound you've been hoping to hear for what feels like hours now. Moving water, somewhere ahead, growing gradually louder as you continue. You reach the riverbank eventually, wider and swifter than you'd perhaps hoped, dark water catching what little pre-dawn light exists and reflecting it back in shifting, uncertain patterns. There's no obvious bridge nearby, no convenient ford that you can immediately identify in the dim remaining darkness. You follow the bank for a while, searching for a safer crossing point, aware that both the growing daylight and your own accumulated exhaustion are working steadily against you now. Eventually, you find a section where the river narrows slightly, rocks visible breaking its surface at intervals that might, with sufficient care, offer an actual path across. The crossing proves difficult, cold water soaking you thoroughly despite your careful efforts, the current stronger than it appeared from the bank, testing your balance and your injured ankle equally at every uncertain step. You slip once, catching yourself just before the current claims you fully, scrambling gracelessly onto the next rock with hands scraped raw against unforgiving stone. You reach the far bank eventually, soaked, shivering, considerably more exhausted than you were even an hour earlier, but genuinely, meaningfully further from the castle than you've managed at any point since climbing that scaffolding. Rivers, you recall vaguely from old stories about pursued men throughout history, often confuse trackers and hounds alike, water-disrupting scent and obvious trail in ways solid ground never quite manages. Whether that old wisdom holds any actual truth, you have no real way of confirming. But crossing it feels, regardless, like crossing something more significant than simply water, a genuine boundary between the world that nearly killed you and whatever uncertain territory lies ahead. You allow yourself a brief moment, dripping and shivering on the riverbank, before continuing onward into the gradually lightening dawn. Following the riverbank briefly before attempting your crossing, you notice, half hidden among reeds and undergrowth, the weathered remains of a small rowing boat, clearly abandoned some while ago, its wood swollen and split along one side. You consider it carefully for a moment, weighing whether it might offer a safer crossing than wading directly through the current. A brief inspection, though, reveals the boat's condition to be worse than first appeared. A genuine hole visible near its base, almost certainly the reason it was abandoned here, rather than properly maintained or moved elsewhere. It's a small disappointment, though not, you decide quickly, a significant setback. The rocky crossing point you'd already identified further along remains available regardless, and precious time spent trying to repair or otherwise use this ruined boat would likely cost you considerably more than the modest advantage it might have offered, even if functional. You leave it where it lies, continuing instead toward your originally planned crossing, though the brief encounter leaves you thinking, briefly, about all the small abandoned things scattered throughout this countryside, evidence of other lives, other stories, other decisions made and left behind long before your own current circumstances ever began. The rocks await you a short distance further along, exactly as you remembered them, and you approach the water's edge once more, steadying yourself for the difficult crossing still ahead. Whatever the ruined boat's own story might have been, it offers you nothing further tonight beyond this brief, passing moment of consideration. You turn from it deliberately, focusing once more on the immediate, practical challenge of getting yourself safely across this cold, swift-moving water toward whatever lies on the opposite bank. The sky continues lightening steadily as you push onward from the riverbank, and the significance of that particular fact settles over you gradually, powerfully, somewhere between exhaustion and genuine disbelief. This is the dawn that was meant to end everything. Somewhere behind you, considerably behind you now, a crowd is likely gathering in a town square around a gallows finished just yesterday afternoon, waiting for a prisoner who, by every reasonable expectation, anyone held as recently as last night, should currently be standing before them rather than stumbling exhausted through unfamiliar countryside miles away. You allow yourself finally a moment to properly feel the weight of what you've actually accomplished, rather than simply continuing to push through it as pure mechanical necessity. 24 hours ago, you woke in that cell, believing, as anyone reasonably would, that today's dawn represented the absolute limit of your remaining existence. Every hour since has been borrowed against that fixed expectation, gathered piece by careful piece into something you're only now, in this exhausted, disbelieving moment, allowing yourself to properly recognize as a genuine, complete escape. It isn't over. Not entirely. Pursuit remains a real possibility, perhaps already organizing itself behind you even now. You have no clear destination yet beyond the vague hope of villages somewhere ahead, no resources beyond what little strength and determination carried you this far. But dawn has come, and you are not standing before that gallows. You allow yourself, finally, something you haven't permitted throughout this entire tense day and night, a single, unsteady breath that catches, briefly, somewhere between exhaustion and something considerably closer to genuine emotion than you've allowed yourself since this whole ordeal began. Then you straighten, wipe your face, and continue walking, aware that emotion, however justified, still won't carry you the remaining distance toward actual safety. The sun continues rising steadily ahead of you, indifferent to everything it very nearly witnessed, warming the countryside with the same ordinary golden light it offers every morning, regardless of who happens to be walking beneath it. By mid-morning, exhaustion has become something closer to a genuine physical crisis, your legs barely cooperating, your soaked clothing having done little to warm properly. Despite hours of continued walking under the strengthening sun, you find the village more by fortunate accident than any deliberate navigation, smoke rising from a scattering of modest cottages, visible finally through thinning trees ahead. You hesitate at its edge, aware that any village, however distant from the castle you fled, might still pose genuine risk if word of an escaped prisoner has somehow already traveled faster than you managed on foot. But exhaustion, eventually, overrules caution. You approach the nearest cottage, its door opening before you've even properly knocked, an older woman's face appearing, initially wary, softening quickly into something closer to concern once she takes proper stock of your condition. She asks few questions, the practical kind of woman who's clearly seen enough hardship in her own life to recognize it plainly in someone else without requiring extensive explanation. She ushers you inside, toward a modest fire already burning, offers dry cloth and a simple meal without demanding immediate answers you're honestly too exhausted to properly provide. You offer her a careful, partial version of events, enough to explain your condition without revealing details that might endanger either of you should word eventually spread. She listens without obvious judgment, the particular weary wisdom of someone who understands well enough that justice in this century rarely concerns itself with fairness, that a stranger's desperate flight might easily represent genuine injustice rather than deserved punishment. She offers, eventually, a corner of her modest home where you might rest properly, at least until you've recovered enough strength to consider what comes next. You accept gratefully, genuinely, aware of exactly how fortunate this small kindness actually represents after everything the previous day and night demanded of you. You settle near her fire, warmth finally beginning to properly return to your exhausted body, and allow yourself, for the first time in longer than you can properly recall, something approaching genuine safety. As the day wears on and your strength gradually returns, the woman who's taken you in asks a few careful questions, though considerably fewer than you'd expected given the circumstances. She wants to know, mostly, whether anyone actually knows to look for you here specifically, whether your presence in her home represents genuine ongoing danger to her own modest, quiet life. You answer as honestly as you reasonably can, explaining that your escape likely wasn't discovered until sometime after dawn, that you've crossed a river and considerable forest since then, that any organized search would need considerable luck to have already narrowed its attention toward this specific small village. She nods slowly at this, apparently satisfied enough, though you notice her glancing occasionally toward her small window regardless. An old habit of caution, you suspect, predates your own arrival by considerably longer than one single day. She doesn't ask about your original crime, the specific accusation that led to your death sentence in the first place. Perhaps she assumes, correctly enough given everything you've told her about the speed and unfairness of your trial, that the details matter less than the plain fact of your survival. Perhaps she's simply lived long enough to understand that justice and truth don't always arrive together in this century, that a condemned man fleeing execution isn't automatically a guilty one. You find yourself grateful for her restraint, unwilling, honestly, to relive the specifics of accusations and hurried judgment again, so soon after finally escaping their most immediate consequence. She offers instead practical guidance. Which direction leads toward a larger town, where a stranger might disappear more easily into general anonymity? Which roads to avoid where the castle's authority likely still carries genuine weight? Roughly, how many days' travel separate her modest village from anywhere, genuinely safe from whatever pursuit might eventually organize itself? You listen carefully, gratefully, storing this new practical information alongside everything else this long, extraordinary day has taught you about survival, patience, and the quiet, unexpected kindness strangers sometimes offer when it's needed most. Later that same afternoon, while you're resting still beside the woman's fire, a sudden knock at her door sends a jolt of sharp alarm through your exhausted body, every careful instinct from the previous night's escape immediately, involuntarily reasserting itself. The woman moves calmly to answer it, gesturing you with a brief, practical glance toward a shadowed corner near her modest hearth, where you might remain less immediately visible without appearing obviously hidden. You comply quickly, heart pounding, as she opens the door to reveal a traveling merchant, someone apparently known to her from previous passages through this small village, seeking nothing more urgent than directions and perhaps a brief rest for his own tired horse. You listen, tense from your shadowed corner, as she exchanges ordinary pleasantries with him, offering water for his animal, mentioning nothing whatsoever about her current unexpected guest. The merchant, for his part, seems entirely occupied with his own journey's practical concerns, showing no particular curiosity about the modest cottage's interior beyond the doorway itself. He mentions, in passing, news from the nearby town, something about unusual activity at the castle today. Guards apparently searching the surrounding roads with more than their typical thoroughness. Your pulse quickens further at this confirmation that your absence has indeed been discovered. That organized pursuit is genuinely underway exactly as you'd anticipated. The merchant, fortunately, seems to view this news as nothing more than mildly interesting gossip, rather than anything requiring further investigation on his own part. He thanks the woman for the water, remounts his rested horse, and continues on his way without ever suspecting how close he came to encountering the very escaped prisoner apparently being searched for along these same roads. The woman closes her door carefully, glancing toward your shadowed corner with a small, reassuring nod. You exhale slowly, feeling your racing heart gradually begin settling again, grateful for both her calm composure and the traveler's simple, fortunate incuriosity. Later, alone briefly while the woman attends to some ordinary household task, you allow yourself, finally, a proper accounting of everything the past day and night actually demanded of you. The cell, memorized stone by stone across however many days of imprisonment, preceded this final one. The guard's rhythm, patiently measured, the priest's unwitting mention of tonight's rotation, the jailer's small, weary kindness, the stable boy's whispered risk offered twice, each time at genuine personal danger. The crack in the wall, worked slowly and carefully across an entire long day of watching for opportunity. The tight, dark passage beyond it, the wine cellar, the kitchens, the courtyard's careful crossing, the scaffolding's uncertain climb, the forest, the river, the dawn that should have ended everything and didn't. None of it, considered honestly, guaranteed success at any single point along the way. Any one of a dozen small moments could have unfolded differently. A guard checking your cell slightly earlier than routine dictated. The stable boy's risk discovered before he could pass along his crucial information. The scaffolding failing beneath your weight. The river's current claiming you fully, rather than merely soaking you thoroughly. You survived, in the end, through some combination of careful, patient attention, genuine, unexpected kindness from people who had little obvious reason to risk themselves on your behalf, and, honestly, no small measure of simple fortune arriving at precisely the moments it mattered most. You think, briefly, of the blacksmith whose old debt you never actually called upon, wondering whether his quiet influence played any role in tonight's fortunate gaps in the castle's usual vigilance, or whether everything unfolded, ultimately, through nothing more than your own careful effort and a night's worth of ordinary human carelessness among tired, distracted guards. It hardly matters now, you decide, letting the question go. You survived. That plain, extraordinary fact matters considerably more than untangling precisely which combination of factors made it possible. You lean back against the woman's modest wall, feeling genuine exhaustion finally begin overtaking the last of your careful, watchful tension, and allow your eyes, for the first time in longer than you can properly measure, to close without immediate fear of what waking might bring. Resting quietly beside the fire, your mind performs a brief, quiet accounting, gathering together everything this single extraordinary day has actually cost, and given you in equal measure. It cost you fear, more sustained and total than you'd ever previously experienced. Hour after hour of careful calculation against a deadline that felt, for most of the day, entirely inescapable. It cost you comfort, dignity, the ordinary presumption of a future that most people move through their days never needing to question so directly. It cost, too, whatever remained of your previous unquestioned trust in the fairness of the world's larger systems, the courts and officials who decided your fate with such careless speed. But it gave you, in exchange, something you suspect you'll carry forward as genuine, permanent knowledge, rather than simply passing experience. It gave you proof, direct and undeniable, of your own capacity for patient, careful thought, even under the most extreme possible pressure. It gave you the stable boy's quiet courage, offered twice at real risk to himself. It gave you the jailer's small, tired kindness, and the old prisoner's useful warning about impatience, and the priest's unwitting mention of tonight's rotation, and finally, most movingly, this stranger's continued, unearned generosity, offering warmth and food, and now even a letter of introduction to a stranger she found soaked and exhausted at her door. You suspect, drifting now properly toward sleep, that you'll spend considerable time in whatever life follows this extraordinary day properly processing everything it actually meant. The fear and the gratitude both, in equal, complicated measure. For tonight, though, the accounting is simple enough. You are alive. You are warm. You are, against every reasonable expectation you held just 24 hours ago, genuinely, remarkably safe. That, tonight, is more than sufficient. You feel your body settle a little further into the warmth around you, thoughts growing softer, slower, gradually loosening their careful grip. You'd imagined, at various exhausted points throughout the previous night's escape, that freedom, once genuinely achieved, might arrive as something dramatic, some overwhelming rush of triumphant emotion matching the scale of everything you'd risked to reach it. Instead, sitting quietly now beside a stranger's humble fire, freedom feels considerably quieter than that, and somehow more genuine for its very quietness. It feels like the simple, uncomplicated warmth of a fire you didn't have to fight for. It feels like bread offered without suspicion, water that isn't measured out in meager, calculated rations. It feels like the particular relief of muscles finally permitted to properly rest after far too many hours of sustained tension and effort. You think, distantly, of the cell you left behind, already perhaps discovered empty by now. Guards and the unfamiliar new captain scrambling to explain an escape that happened, in the end, through nothing more dramatic than patient attention and a handful of small human kindnesses nobody in that castle properly anticipated. You think of the gallows, finished just yesterday, standing empty this morning in a town square that gathered, if it gathered at all, only to be told that today's expected spectacle simply wouldn't be occurring as scheduled. You allow yourself, cautiously, a small measure of something you haven't properly felt in longer than this single extraordinary day, genuine hope for whatever remains of your actual life, rather than simply desperate calculation aimed at surviving its next immediate threat. The woman returns eventually, checking on you with the same practical, undemanding concern she's offered since first opening her door, and mentions that you're welcome to rest properly through the remainder of today before considering whatever comes next tomorrow. You thank her genuinely and accept gladly, aware that whatever practical challenges still lie ahead, tonight, at least, doesn't require the same desperate vigilance that carried you through the previous one. You close your eyes again, properly this time, and allow exhaustion, finally, to have its way with you entirely. As evening settles properly over the small village, you find yourself, for the first time in longer than you can clearly remember, without any particular need to track the passing hours at all. There's no schedule pressing against you now, no execution arranged for dawn, no careful counting of guard rhythms or shift changes, no desperate arithmetic converting daylight into a shrinking, finite resource. Time, this evening, is simply time again, passing at its own unhurried pace without any particular demand attached to it. You sit near the woman's fire as she prepares a simple evening meal, offering to help in whatever small way your still recovering body allows, grateful for the ordinary, undramatic rhythm of an evening spent doing nothing more urgent than existing safely in one place. She asks, eventually, gently, what you intend to do next once you've properly recovered your strength. You admit, honestly, that you haven't fully decided, that yesterday's entire focus was survival itself rather than any clear plan for whatever life might follow it. She nods at this, unsurprised, mentioning that such decisions rarely need making immediately, that a few more days' rest and careful thought will serve you considerably better than any hurried decision made from lingering exhaustion and fear. You accept her wisdom gratefully, aware of how fortunate you've been to land, quite by exhausted accident, in the care of someone this genuinely generous with a stranger she owed absolutely nothing. The meal is simple, modest, entirely unremarkable by any objective measure. It tastes, regardless, like the finest thing you've eaten in longer than you can properly recall, seasoned considerably by the plain, extraordinary fact that you're genuinely, safely here to taste it at all. You eat slowly, gratefully, watching firelight flicker across the humble room's modest walls, and feel, for the first time since waking in that cell 24 hours and one entire lifetime ago, something approaching genuine peace. As evening settles properly and the immediate fright of the afternoon's near encounter fades into something more manageable, the woman mentions, carefully, a possibility you hadn't previously considered. She has, she explains, a nephew in a distant town, considerably further from the castle's direct authority than her own modest village, a man who might, if approached carefully, offer temporary work and lodging to a stranger with an understandable reason for seeking fresh anonymity elsewhere. She offers, generously, to send word ahead on your behalf, a brief letter carried by whatever traveling merchant or messenger next passes through, heading in the appropriate direction. You consider this offer carefully, genuinely moved by the continued generosity of someone who owes you nothing whatsoever beyond simple shared humanity. It represents, you recognize immediately, a considerably better prospect than simply wandering uncertainly from village to village, hoping for continued fortune, matching what's carried you this far already. You accept gratefully, and she moves to a small writing implement kept, apparently, for exactly these occasional practical purposes, carefully composing a brief message on a scrap of parchment by the fire's flickering light. She reads it aloud to you before sealing it, a simple, carefully worded request that reveals nothing incriminating while still conveying genuine need to whoever eventually receives it. You thank her again, aware that words alone feel entirely inadequate against everything she's already risked and offered on your behalf since first opening her door to a soaked, exhausted stranger. She waves off your gratitude, mentioning simply that kindness offered without expectation of return is the only kind genuinely worth offering at all. You settle back near the fire, this new possibility offering, for the first time since your escape began, something resembling an actual future rather than simply moment-to-moment survival. Tomorrow, perhaps, a messenger carries her letter onward. Tonight, you allow yourself simply to rest, grateful beyond easy words for a stranger's continued, quiet generosity. Later, as the fire burns low and the woman retires to her own rest, you remain a while longer beside its fading warmth, turning over everything the past day has taught you that you suspect you'll carry forward, regardless of wherever your uncertain future actually leads. You've learned, properly, what patient attention can accomplish even in circumstances that seem, at first, to offer no possible advantage at all. A guard's schedule, once genuinely understood, becomes a map rather than simply an obstacle. A crumbling wall, worked carefully across enough patient hours, becomes an actual door rather than remaining merely a flaw. Small human kindnesses, offered by people with every reasonable excuse to simply look away instead, can matter considerably more than any grand, dramatic gesture. You've learned, too, something about the particular value of ordinary life once its continuation is no longer something you're permitted to simply assume. That small room above a shop, those unremarkable shared meals you never thought to properly appreciate at the time. You suspect, genuinely, that you'll notice such things differently now, more carefully, more gratefully, having spent one entire day believing they were already lost to you forever. You think, briefly, of the stable boy, hoping fervently that his double risk on your behalf goes forever unnoticed by whoever eventually investigates your escape. You think of the jailer, hoping his small kindnesses never draw suspicion onto a man simply doing an unpleasant job as gently as circumstances allowed. You think of the blacksmith, wherever he currently is, wondering whether his old debt played any actual role in tonight's fortunate outcome, or whether it simply lived unused, as a quiet reminder that decency sometimes returns dividends in ways you never anticipated needing. The fire continues its slow fade toward embers, and you feel your own eyes growing heavy in response, exhaustion finally, fully overtaking whatever remaining alertness carried you through this entire extraordinary day and night. You allow it, gratefully, gladly, for the first time without any lingering fear of what waking might eventually bring. The small cottage settles into proper quiet around you, the woman's steady breathing audible faintly from her own corner of the modest home, the fire's last embers glowing softly in the deepening dark. Outside, somewhere beyond walls considerably more humble than the castle's imposing stone, an ordinary countryside night continues its own unhurried rhythm, indifferent in its own gentle way to everything you survived to reach it. Wind moves quietly through nearby trees. Somewhere distant, an owl calls once, then falls silent again. You think, one final time, of that cell you woke in yesterday morning, believing then that today's dawn represented the absolute limit of whatever life remained to you. You think of the gallows, finished and waiting, of the crowd that gathered or didn't gather this morning to witness an execution that, thanks to one entire day's worth of patient attention and unexpected kindness, simply never actually happened. You are here instead, warm beside a stranger's dying fire, in a modest cottage considerably humbler than anywhere you've called home before. And it feels, despite everything, like the safest place you've ever properly rested. Tomorrow will bring its own uncertain questions. Where you travel next, how you rebuild whatever remains of a life so abruptly, unjustly interrupted. Whether the accusation that nearly ended everything ever properly resolves itself, or simply fades slowly into the past, the way so many small injustices in this century eventually do, unresolved, but no longer actively pursued. None of that concerns you tonight. Tonight is simply about the ordinary, extraordinary fact of still existing to worry about it at all. You feel your breathing slow, matching itself gradually to the fire's soft, fading glow. Exhaustion finally, completely claiming you. Before sleep fully claims you, you find yourself thinking, briefly, of the narrow strip of sky visible from your cell's small barred window, the limited, frustrating glimpse of stars. You'd occasionally caught through it during however many days you spent imprisoned there. Tonight, though you can't currently see them from your spot beside the fire, you know the same stars are turning overhead across an entirely unobstructed sky, visible in full to anyone willing to simply step outside and look properly upward. You imagine, briefly, doing exactly that, though your exhausted body has no genuine intention of actually rising to check. It's a small thing, perhaps, comparing a night sky glimpsed through prison bars against one theoretically visible in full from open ground. But it carries, somehow, considerable weight regardless, a small, concrete measure of exactly how much yesterday's careful, patient escape actually changed about your immediate circumstances. You think of the guard whose rhythm you measured so carefully, wondering whether he's currently facing consequences for whatever oversight allowed your escape, hoping, genuinely, that whatever punishment follows isn't excessive, given that he was, ultimately, simply, an ordinary man doing an ordinary job rather than any particular villain in your story. You think of the new captain, presumably facing considerably harsher scrutiny, given his very first night commanding this specific rotation ended in an escaped prisoner, rather than the flawless discipline he likely hoped to demonstrate. None of these thoughts carry any real bitterness. Mostly, you feel simply grateful, exhausted, and quietly amazed that an entire day, which began with absolute certainty of your own death, has ended instead, with you drifting toward sleep beside a stranger's humble fire, genuinely, remarkably safe. Your eyes close fully now, the last of your careful, watchful tension finally releasing entirely into the fire's soft, remaining warmth. Sleep arrives gradually now, the way it rarely has throughout this entire extraordinary day. no longer something to be carefully managed or measured against a shrinking, desperate deadline. You think, one final time, of everything the past 24 hours actually demanded. Patient attention to a guard's ordinary rhythm, careful work at a crumbling wall, the quiet courage of a stable boy risking real danger twice on a near stranger's behalf, a jailer's small, unremarked kindness, a tight, dark passage, a wine cellar, a courtyard crossed in careful shadow, a scaffolding climbed with trembling hands, a forest, a river, a dawn that should have meant your death and instead simply continued ordinarily into an entirely different life. None of it felt heroic while you were living through it. Not really. Mostly it felt like fear, carefully managed, converted deliberately into patient, methodical action, one small step at a time. That, you suspect, is what survival actually looks like, far more often than the dramatic stories eventually told about it suggest. Not a single triumphant moment, but an accumulation of small, careful choices, each one mattering enormously precisely because none of them, individually, guaranteed anything at all. You are here now regardless, warm, safe, exhausted, in the particular way that only comes after genuine danger has finally, properly passed. The fire beside you continues its slow fade toward morning embers. Somewhere outside, ordinary countryside night continues its own unhurried rhythm, entirely unaware of and entirely indifferent to the fact that you very nearly didn't survive to witness it. That indifference, strangely, feels like its own quiet comfort now. The world continues regardless of what almost happened to you within it, the same way it will continue tomorrow and the day after, regardless of wherever your own uncertain path eventually leads. For tonight, none of that matters yet. Close your eyes. Let the fire finish its own quiet work without you. Let tomorrow arrive whenever it's ready to. And sleep the way only someone who nearly lost the chance to ever sleep peacefully again truly can, deeply, gratefully, entirely at rest.